Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's conversation. My name is Chris Fuller, and I am the Vice President, Chief Sponsorship and Mission Integration Officer at St. Joseph's College of Maine. And this is an event being sponsored by St. Joseph's Center for Faith and Spirituality. And the topic of tonight's conversation is Conscience and the Common Good. And my conversation partner is Dr. Charles Camosey, who is the Associate Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Fordham University. Dr. Camosey is an award-winning author of 4 books, and soon to be 5, that draw upon Catholic moral theology, and his numerous academic articles have appeared in the Journal of Moral Theology, Horizons, the American Journal of Bioethics, Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, and the Journal of Catholic Health Association. He's also published significant popular essays in places like USA Today, Los Angeles Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Washington Post, the Newark Star-Ledger, America, and Commonwealth. And he's also well known for his public conversations on hot button issues with folks from a variety of different perspectives. In particular, his conversations with Charles Singer over the topic of abortion. So, Dr. Camosey, thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation. We appreciate you having us with us.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm sorry that I was difficult in getting to be with you, and I thank you for your flexibility and the flexibility of everyone on the call. Sorry about my life and my family's life getting in the way last time.
That's okay. I think we all understand these days of Zoom and Google Meet and family life, the difficulties of navigating all that together. So I asked you specifically to be part of this conversation tonight because of your background, because of your not only your academic work, but your interest in engaging in kind of the public conversation over topics and issues. And this topic for tonight actually came from a conversation I was having with someone who raised the question of how do we employ our conscience in relation to the idea of the common good. So I kind of want to start from the kind of foundational in our conversation, just start with conscience itself. And, the kind of popular definition of conscience is it's that inner voice that tells me whether I'm doing good or bad or good or evil. And I think I'll start there. Is that the Catholic understanding of conscience, or is it something more?
Well, it's something more, but I think it's fair to say that there's something true about that. Let me just make a caveat here, and maybe this is an annoying caveat that all academics or most of us try to give. It's Catholic theologians especially disagree about conscience all the time, and there's some things we agree on, but there's many things we don't. So what you'll hear from me tonight, though I will cite a lot of church documents and whatnot and authors, I just want to say that up front. There's a lot of us who have very fun, sometimes not so fun, arguments about these things. But in general, I think the position of the church is that conscience is here's something we definitely agree on. Conscience is an absolutely sacred space for human beings. It's one of the most important places, frankly, that human beings come to interact with the divine. And in a way that describes it so beautifully, I just wanted to quote, if you don't mind, Gaudium et Spes, from the documents of Vatican Council II on conscience. It's one of the most beautiful descriptions of anything in any church document, I think. But this might be a good place to start. Here's the quote. In the depths of his conscience, humanity detects a law which he does not impose upon himself, but which holds him to obedience, always summoning him to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to his heart. Do this, shun that. For humanity, man has in his heart written a law, in his heart, a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of humanity and man. According to it, he will be judged. And here is the kicker I just love. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of man. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in his depths. I mean, come on. It's just so beautiful. And that's a place I think most of us, if not all of us, can kind of agree and stay with. It's this secret core sanctuary where we are alone with God and encounter God, and God's voice echoes in our depths in a very particular way.
And, and in that description too, there is something, I guess, more than the definition I started with, right? That is, there is a conversation in some manner with something exterior to ourselves, right? In this case, our relationship with God. So could you maybe expand on that? What is that dynamic of that kind of that summoning to us, or that relational nature with God that is perhaps different than again what I started, which is, well, whatever I decide, my conscience is kind of whatever I decide is good or bad. That's very interior, but what you just shared with us is there's something outside of us that also is part of how the conscience, how we deliberate as a matter of conscience, correct?
Yeah. So it's very much a relationship, right? It's exchange almost between two entities, two individuals, a God and us. So it's definitely not what the culture might have us believe. It's kind of like your opinion or kind of gut feeling that you have or something like that. No, it's something much more about a relationship with the divine, with God. And that means it takes work, right? All relationships take work. But especially the one with God takes work, and especially this kind of relationship, right? I think about, as I was thinking about talking with you today, I was thinking about how I would have thought about this conversation 20 years ago versus how I might, think about it today with you. And one really significant difference, I think, is the advent of the smartphone and social media as just almost a constant hum in the background of our lives, or many of our lives, that really impinges on our ability to hear God's voice echoing in the depths, right? That, in the past, we had quiet time or bored time or daydreaming time, or even frankly, just, time we set for prayer. Too often the kind of technology, and I realize it's somewhat ironic given that we're having this conversation via technology, but too often, if not seen in its proper, hierarchy of goods, technology can get in the way of precisely this kind of, the Catechism talks about how it's important for every person to be sufficiently present to him or herself to hear and follow the voice of conscience. And there are a lot of things that can distract us from the reflection, self-examining, and introspection that's necessary to hear it. And so I think it's very important, frankly, to be aware of the ways technology kind of crowds out the space for that kind of relationship we need to have.
Have you seen that difference you're describing? Have you seen it in the students you've taught, in terms of like the generational? You and I are probably roughly similar age. We probably taught similar groups of students, perhaps over 2 generations now. Have you seen a transition in when you're trying to teach this to students in terms of their ability to kind of grapple with what it is you're trying to get them to see or understand?
Yes, I've seen a definite change, and there's actually been just a broader change. I think almost across the board change amongst my students as a result of this. But this is definitely one place where the change is quite obvious and the damage quite significant. The hopeful thing is, though, is most of my students get it, they understand, and they don't like that it's been kind of foisted on them, like somebody else is the one making the algorithm that keeps them scrolling, right? Someone else is telling them at age 14 they need to have a smartphone. Well, they often ask for it too, but I know as a parent I've had so much pressure on me and my wife to let our kids have smartphones from school, right? Not friends, from school even. And all the data shows this is just horrible. It's even worse than smoking for people. So when we get into sufficient depth and discuss this, my students do get that not only is this unhealthy just across the board, but it's particularly a problem for getting to this place of God's voice echoing in our depths. Because I think as you mentioned, we're probably the same age. There was lots of time for us and for our early students we talked to kind of be bored, right? To have moments of daydreaming and self-reflection. time for God to kind of speak to you in the depths. But now that time is very often intentionally filled with scrolling on one's smartphone. One funny way I always bring up with my students is when people are waiting outside our classrooms for a professor that's kind of gone overtime, that was the time where you kind of had to be bored and sit and wait around. And now it's just people looking and scrolling on their phones. But that would be any time, right? I mean, I actually think, sorry, it's a long answer, but I actually think trying to rekindle boredom and daydreaming is one of the most important things we can do as instructors. I don't know if it's possible, but I think it's worth trying to do that.
It's almost as if I would describe it, we have shifted the relational dimension from the exterior dynamic of the relational dimension from, as you said, either quiet space or time for reflection or boredom, and from a Christian perspective, the opening to God, to, they said the algorithms of likes and comments.
Right. I mean, and that the time that you might spend being bored or in prayer or daydreaming is time that you're not curating your virtual persona, time that you're not out there seeing what other people want you to post and what gets likes and hearts and what stuff does not. So you're totally right about that.
So let's add another dimension to that then. We have, as you said, with the opening up to God, this relational dimension. What role then does church teaching play in that dynamic, that relational dynamic of kind of forming the conscience? Right? The church teaches that we are to have informed consciences. What does it mean to have an informed conscience?
Well, I thought you might ask about that, and that's where some of the disagreement comes in among even faithful theologians. I mean, there are some theologians that are just kind of totally doing their own thing apart from the church. But even among those who really do try to connect themselves to the teaching of the church, to the tradition of the church, there's disagreement about this question. Because at bottom, we're trying to hold two things together that are in some tension. And the first is that we have an obligation to follow our conscience, right? If our conscience is telling us to do something, we have an obligation to follow it, moral obligation to follow it. But then it's just true that our consciences can give us wrong direction, morally wrong direction. Now, then there are multiple reasons why our consciences might give us wrong direction, and some obviously don't excuse us, right? So if we allow ourselves to again get totally lost in the noise of Instagram and TikTok and Twitter, and I'm not excusing myself from this. I'm just as guilty as anyone else. Then that's the kind of ignorance that we bear, or the kind of misinformation or mistake that we bear some responsibility for. But if the what's the technical term, invincible ignorance, if the invincible ignorance is there is no fault of your own, it's just kind of a situation to which you've been born, or maybe when you're a child, someone takes advantage of you and gives you all sorts of fills your head with all sorts of things that are mistaken, that are not obviously your fault. And there's other examples of this too, and that's kind of where the disagreement comes in. What is your fault and what is not? What is a well-formed conscience and what is a conscience that has been malformed as a choice we've made or decision we've made? But we are, I think, leaving those arguments aside, everyone agrees, I think, that there are some circumstances in which our consciences give us wrong information for reasons that aren't our moral fault. They have nothing to do with anything we did wrong. And so what do you do, without being a moral relativist? Do you say, well, you have to follow your wrong conscience? Thomas Aquinas did. Lots of faithful theologians say that. Others say, well, no, like if it bumps up against church teaching, which is where your question went, then you kind of know right away that your conscience has been malformed, and you should kind of take a step back and think this through. But that's even complicated too, right? Because some of the most important thinkers, theologians and non-theologians, philosophers, and just regular folks have come to a conclusion conclusion that something the church is telling them to do is not acceptable, right? When I was thinking of examples for talking to you, I was thinking of Pope Urban ordering the First Crusade. I can imagine, I hope I can imagine, I can't imagine some coming to the conclusion that that doesn't fit with the gospel, and that their consciences would have rightly pushed them in a different direction. So it's kind of, that's where we're starting. I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but that's where we kind of get into the complexities of these things. My own view is that the church's teaching is kind of a warning sign. It's a big kind of like big caution. If your conscience is telling you something that is against church teaching, or something a church official with authority is saying, that's a reason for you to do some really deep searching and introspection and prayer to think, well, what exactly is going on here, right? Is my conscience well formed, or is it malformed, or is it really not being formed at all, except by, again, the kind of virtual persona I'm inhabiting online, or some other force or pressure.
And is that in that process where someone might find themselves bumping up against church teaching, right? That they is there a difference between disagreement and dissent in terms of how one navigates or relates to this dynamic, right? That you're identifying, and the process that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's different approaches here, but from my perspective, disagreement is something fairly common, and like most Catholics in the United States use contraception, for instance, and most don't give all their money to the poor except what they need to live on, according to Catholic social teachings dictates. So there's just plenty of folks who don't agree with church teaching. Most Catholics, I think it's fair to say, don't agree with every word of church teaching. But dissent takes it to a formal level in a way that has to be reckoned with formally. At least that's my understanding of the difference there. But I really think I'm a faithful Catholic theologian. I'm in line with the church on virtually everything, I think. Some people might disagree with that, but I think that's right. But I think it's just, we're living in a really strange world if we think we can not just acknowledge the way most Catholics live, the way most Catholics, what they believe, what they think. I mean, that's different from formal dissent, it seems to me, and we need to treat that properly and with pastoral care.
And do you, when you're either talking to students or in public talks about topics like this in moral teaching, how do you again, our American, it's very common in America just to say, well, I don't like it, or I disagree, right? And we've decided that we're the origin of that, right? Disagreement. How do you then talk with people or suggest to them ways in which they might see that a perspective outside themselves might actually offer something they weren't considering, right? And teaching being one of those, church teaching being one of those aspects, right? That it might actually offer something you haven't considered because you're just viscerally reacting to it rather than kind of taking a step back.
Yeah, I'm one way I can, and I guess we all do this to a certain extent, is I draw my own experience here. I was pretty much a kind of unthinking Catholic who kind of, I don't even really know if I really understood or could articulate church teaching very much at all as a teenager. And then when I went to college, kind of, it's a similar story to lots of people, I guess, kind of blew my socks off, and I was challenged in ways I was never challenged before, and subject to certain arguments I'd never heard before, stories from history I'd never encountered before, and basically lost my faith and became somewhat of an agnostic, I think it's fair to say. I never really lost my Catholicism, though, which is an interesting phenomenon. I think we need to pay more attention to Catholic agnostics and atheists who kind of remain connected to the faith somehow, and ripe for reversion, I think, in some ways. But my experience was being brought back to the church by people I encountered, faithful people who were well educated, who had heard all the same arguments and who had heard all the same stories from history, and nevertheless come out on the other side as faithful Catholics and had views on lots of things that I, at the time, disagreed with. But over time, my encounters with them really caused me to rethink things and come to believe that what the church teaches on these matters is true. And that's where it opened me up to God's voice speaking in my own depths in ways I was really not open to before. That's why it's so important for us to cultivate encounters, I think, across difference. I'm just finishing a book on precisely this in the church. I think it's so important we allow ourselves. This is one thing, social media algorithms, sorry I'm talking so much about this, but it's just, I think it totally dominates so many of our lives today. That's why it's so important to push back against the social media algorithms that just confirm our biases, right? And put something in our feeds that just confirms what we thought before. If that's all we get and we self-segregate we have the great sort into people we just think like us, it really limits the ability for those encounters to really push us in a different direction. So that's one person's story, but I think I know I'm not the only one who's done that. And so I think it's, in the interest of being genuinely open-minded, right? And that's one of the things the church can really offer us, right? The church is one of those few places that is still, at least in theory, a place where lots of people who disagree with each other about lots of things still go together and sit next to each other in pews, right, on Sundays, and who come to the same basketball games and church socials and fundraisers and service projects. And so to the extent the church can be a place of encounter, which is one of the things Pope Francis has been so clear on, is the duty to kind of create a culture of encounter as opposed to a throwaway culture, which pushes others who are not like us aside. I think that's really a place where we need to live if we're going to make a space, again, for God to speak in our depths in new ways.
You mentioned the kind of the willingness to encounter others. Which at this moment, right now in America, we're very polarized. And you're right, the social media just further feeds it by feeding us things that correspond to wherever we hit likes, whether it be on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, further, amplifying that polarization. And yet you have, part of your work has been these public conversations with people that the different sides are telling us we shouldn't be having conversations with, right? I'm thinking in particular your conversations with Peter Singer on the topic of abortion. You could not be further apart, I think, in terms of probably your perspectives. And yet I know the two of you had these public conversations, not just once, but on a number of occasions. In fact, I think you co-authored a book together, did you not?
We co-authored a piece together, not a book, but we co-planned a conference, a major international conference on abortion together.
So what have you learned from that process in that kind of encounter with, someone that our culture is telling us right now we shouldn't be having any conversations? It doesn't matter the perspective. If the perspective is different than yours, radically different, we shouldn't be entering into any kind of conversation.
It just seems like such an odd position to hold for Christians, right? Who are called to go preach the gospel to all nations and peoples, and to do it in a way that mimics Christ, right? Who imitates Christ, who said, right, I'm going to the people that no one else wants to touch, right? I'm going to the lepers, to the Samaritans, to the centurions, tax collectors, prostitutes, and on and on. And also, it's just a fact that radical, white-hot disagreement has been part of the church since the very beginning. Peter and Paul are celebrated in the Catholic Church as the pillars of the church, same feast day even. And these guys went at it so hard in the early church. They totally disagree with each other about, in fact, Paul brags about telling Peter off to his face in one of the arguments that they had about basically like how much of the Jewish law should Christians, follow. You can imagine that the people that Paul was trying to convert in Ephesus and Corinth and Rome were not too eager to get circumcised and give up shellfish and whatnot. So, if Peter and Paul, who are celebrated on the same day in the Catholic Church as pillars of the church, could go at it this hard on a really, really important issue, then we should expect, right? This should be our way of thinking. Like, we want deep, profound encounters with those with whom we disagree, as part of who we are as church, not just to spread the gospel, but even within the church itself. I think Peter Singer is worth thinking. You also don't throw your pearls before swine sometimes. I think that's fair. Peter Singer is also someone, despite his views, he's really willing to engage on the level of argument and evidence. And we actually disagree very strongly about the conclusion when it comes to abortion, but we agree very strongly about what's at stake, and where the arguments go. He's frankly one of the few people who's willing to admit that once you deny the humanity of the prenatal child, you also deny the humanity of the postnatal child, because the postnatal child is often, if the postnatal child is born early, there's plenty of prenatal children who are even more developed than the postnatal child. And I could go into more detail, but so when you have somebody who's in good faith, who's willing to engage you, who's, again, willing to be part of a genuine encounter, it shouldn't matter that you have these even wild disagreements. That's what we're called to do as Christians, both inside and outside the church, it seems to me.
So I want to use that as a springboard then for moving from the individual, making the effort to form his or her conscience, to then moving into the public sphere, right? Last 2 years have been a whole host of social upheavals, but that's it's not a unique period. We've had, we're always at some moment, some kind of social issue is at our attention and commanding some kind of conversation or dialogue about it, or disagreement about it. So how would you, what do you what's the relationship between the conscience and the common good? How does one move from the individual work of forming their own conscience then to entering into the public sphere and taking their conscience into the public sphere in relation to the common good, which is another fundamental feature, right, of Catholic social teaching?
Right. So again, complicated question that gets into areas of disagreement among theologians and philosophers and others, bishops even sometimes. There were bishops who during the pandemic, for instance, or the earlier part of the pandemic, disagreed about whether there could be religious exemptions for the vaccine, for instance, and whether conscience protected that or not. I don't know if that's what you have in mind, or you have some other topics you'd like to ask about or get into. But here's two things that are held in balanced tension again. We have a really strong duty to the common good, and that is again at the heart of what it means to be a Christian. At the same time, the church really wants to protect individual conscience, that sanctuary where one encounters God, and to protect it in a way, frankly, from those who want to coerce it, those who are powerful, who might say they're interested in the common good, or might even genuinely mean that they're working for the common good, but have a mistaken view of the common good, or have a very different view of the common good. And the church really wants to respect the rights of individuals to follow their well-formed conscience, even when, say, the government wants to coerce them or something like that, or a large, powerful entity or employer even wants to coerce them, make them choose between their conscience and putting bread on the table for their families. And so you get into this really significant tension, right? Like, the pandemic brings it up I think in a very interesting and difficult way. I got 3 vaccine shots as soon as I could. My family and my children did as well. I'm a big supporter of vaccines. I try to convince fellow Catholics and fellow pro-life Catholics that they should get it too, and that the cooperation with evil is so remote that the common good demands that we get it. But at the same time, I feel really uncomfortable, frankly, with, say, an archdiocese telling every single employee they have to get this, even if it really violates their well-formed conscience, right? If they're forcing them to choose between putting bread on their table for their families and really following their conscience in a very significant way. Now, if I talk to that person, outside of that whole discussion, I would try to convince them to get a vaccine and get vaccinated, because I think that's the right thing to do. But I also feel, and I guess this is in some tension, that the right of conscience is so important, so sacred, so important to defend against a government or a employer trying to manipulate people in a particular way, that we really need to really resist forcing people in these ways to do it. So I guess that's the way I would prefer to try to think about the common good. And I think that's my view. Again, theologians disagree. I've written about this. I had some theologian friends of mine respond saying I'm totally wrong about this. But I think the way to go about trying to pursue the common good is just to convince them through dialogue, through encounter, to do this, not to force them to act against their well-formed conscience.
Do you have, based on, again, your work in other arenas where you've engaged in public conversations on very hot button topics, do you have a recommendation for how to have that conversation? Because again, it's become very polarized, right? It's been very polarized and politicized.
Yeah.
Issue, so that it's almost as if there's not even a willingness to have a conversation with each other on topics like vaccines. Like I said, I'm not interested so much in please tell us if it's right or wrong, as much as your work as a moral theologian, your experience in having these kind of conversations, strategies, recommendations, or where you have seen more effective ways of kind of engaging with each other to try to get past these kind of very polarized barriers that stand between us.
I think it's important to imitate Jesus again, right? He did not treat the woman caught in the very act of adultery, as the gospel says, according to the letter of the law of the day, right? And hammering it home that she needed to be stoned to death. He put her sin, right, her mistake, into a broader context, the context of everyone sinning, right, and judgment, and told her to sin no more, but reacted to her with a kind of deep respect and a counter and clarity and even calm, right? He bends down on the ground to write. He's quiet a little bit and kind of responding to them. All things that we don't do on social media, right? The very opposite of what we do on social media. We do dog piles, we do castigation, we make cartoonish critiques of the people we disagree with. We really don't take time in almost every circumstance to try to get into the shoes of another person, the circumstances of another person, the surrounding factors that might lead someone to come to a conclusion that we disagree with. And then if we just come down with those, cartoonish views, and we totally castigate, and we then again try to force someone on top of everything, force somebody to choose between, going on an airplane to see their grandmother for the last time, or choose between keeping the job, which is putting bread on the table for their family, and following their conscience. What a disaster, right? I mean, you've just set up somebody who's basically an enemy for life. When if you had taken a totally different approach, right? And again, the methods by which, we're able to do this online are few and far between. This is maybe a better one than social media, obviously, but if we take the time instead to dive into an actual encounter, which again is what Pope Francis has called all of us to do, to go out to the peripheries, go out to those groups we don't normally encounter, and have those genuine encounters, that at least gives us a chance, right, to have the encounter affect both of us, frankly, right? Not just our getting on our high horse and preaching, from a top-down context to them, but offering our point of view and giving our reasons for it, but also being willing to and reserving the right to change our own minds and to be changed by the encounter ourselves. And that seems to me, and not just in this circumstance, but in almost all circumstances, to be the way to go about trying to change minds and hearts for the common good. Coercion is necessary in certain circumstances, but in my experience, this is almost always the better way.
Yeah, you mentioned, I was going to ask that as a follow-up, which is, can there be, and I'm not focusing specific on a single issue like vaccines, it could be any type of issue, but can there be occasions where you said the organization, whether it be the diocese or the government, the concern that generates the directive can be sufficient for the common good, that it I don't know if overrides the right word. I'm not finding the right word, or I'll just stick with overrides, but I don't think it's really sufficient. That it's sufficient enough. It's sufficient enough with regard then to the individual's resistance to that directive. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There are obviously some cases like that, but they really, I mean, let me just read the quote from Dignitatis Humanae, which is another Vatican II document. It says, he must not, quote, he must not be forced to act contrary to his conscience, nor must he be prevented from acting according to his conscience, especially in religious matters. So, I mean, the example I was thinking about as you were asking your question was how, at least in the United States, we often give inmates in prison who obviously been coerced against their conscience. I mean, they've been put in prison. We still do our best in many cases, and in any way, to, for instance, give people their conscience rights when in religious matters in prison, right? So if they want the particular kind of holy book, if they want access to religious services and to a holy person, we often try to make that available. And there have been Supreme Court cases which have argued that's part of the constitutional right that people have even when they're in prison. So yes, I mean, there are times we need to incarcerate people for the common good. And that's obviously forcing somebody to act in a particular way. But that, I hope, is in the rarest of cases, right? That's in cases which we need to limit, and we have such an over incarceration problem in the United States, and this is actually one of the things many of us agree about is prison reform. The Trump administration, whatever you think about them, really found common ground with their opponents on prison reform and incarceration reform in a way that I found really gratifying. So, but yes, the answer is there are some cases where for the common good, some people need to be coerced contrary to their conscience. But the presumption in Catholic teaching is that you always try your best to make space for that sacred place between God and the individual.
I want to take it down to a kind of more micro level too. We've talked about big social issues. What about just the local communities? Like how the role of one's conscience in relation to being part of a community. Again, your kind of understanding of how one takes the work that individual interior work they've done into being part of the local civic community, if you will.
Could you give me a more specific example?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. I'm trying to think of. It's a very good question.
Yeah.
Perhaps even just parish communities.
Okay.
Let's stick with that. Let's take the parish community or church communities or religious communities. The role, how one's religious conscience can play a role, can help inform their role as part of their local, religious community.
Yeah, I think I think with big things in public dissent, as we made the distinction before between disagreement and public dissent, there are places and times where the community has to say, well, this, if you don't believe in a Trinity, you kind of put yourself outside of the Christian community. So there are, creedal truths, there are moral truths that are absolutely central to what it means to be part of a particular community. Otherwise, frankly, being part of the community, it isn't clear what it even means to be part of a community at the end of the day, right? If you don't say there are certain things for which it's absolutely essential for members of the community to believe in and to practice. That said, again, I think when you have the kind of language that the church has about conscience, we really need to make lots of space. Not just because there's no coercion in religion and people don't become members of religious faith by coercion. That's not how any of this works, as the kids say. People have to come to their faith on their own. And I just recall my own example of this, right? Like, if somebody had tried to, when I was in college and I was in my rebellious stage, if somebody had tried to shove this in my face, I would have just become more resistant, right? I would have become further away from the community. So happily, there were people who came into my life who were willing to take me where I was and kind of work with me and be gentle with me and be patient with me, but encounter me and push me where I needed to be pushed, and dive into my own particular reality and be my friends and be my colleagues. And as a result, now I'm a theologian myself and trying to do these things on a different kind of level. So you never know where these things will lead. But so that's another tension to kind of hold, that the church often holds, right? Tries to hold balanced things in tension. Even the Trinity itself, right, is an attempt to hold a tension together. Here's another tension to try to hold together, which is, yes, there are things, important things, which we have to hold fast to, which count as markers for the community. But at the same time, people can have different kinds of relationships with those truths over time. And again, if we can, through encounters, help them become more open to God speaking in their depths through their conscience, that's the way forward, it seems to me, not the kind of top-down, smash the dissenters type approach that some want to have.
Yeah, I've described to my students when we've talked about the topic of moral theology, it's the willingness to remain open that a perspective different than yours, even though at this point in your life you may find yourself disagreeing with, through life experiences, the people you meet, you may be at some point later on where you say, oh, now I get it. Now it makes more sense to me than it did because I've lived this experience. I've met these people. I've had this encounter. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's frankly a frustrating thing. I don't know if you feel this as a teacher. I would like my students to come to the different conclusion over the course of a semester-long class, but what I've been told many times by mentors of mine and learned from my own experience is that's totally unrealistic. What we're really doing is planting seeds that maybe will grow later, and just in the ways you just described.
I am a biblical scholar. That's my field. I'm not a moral theologian, but as I have taught in a small college setting, and you teach all kinds of things in small college settings, we teach introductory courses, we cover lots of different topics. It seems to me that in terms of, as you were describing, the trying to enter and engage with people in conversation, the person I always keep coming back to, and I'm a novice in this area, is Thomas Aquinas. That when you read his, my students, when they read his arguments the first time, they're confused. They don't know what he's talking about. They don't know where he's going. And I have to kind of lay out for them. He's starting with the opposing argument first.
Right.
He's trying to let it have its full integrity before then moving to his own argument, because only then does his own argument have some kind of power to it, rather than simply setting up a paper tiger, right? Or caricaturing his opponents. So I just want to get your thoughts on that in terms of not just the theology of Thomas, but the the pattern of Thomas, if you will, of encounter. And is that something that we could be doing more with in terms of thinking about these dynamics of conscience, the common good, and these conversations?
Oh my gosh, yes, yes. I love. I mean, that was some of my first, exposure to anything philosophical or theological, was reading through Thomas Aquinas. It's one of the reasons I became a philosophy major before I started studying theology. Because there's something just beautiful about that, isn't there? Like genuinely starting with your perceived opponent's arguments. And then at the end, this is the underrated part, at the end, he always returns to them and explicitly refutes them in a respectful way, right? Like not in a disrespectful way, but in a way, okay, I realize I started with these three arguments at the beginning. I'm going to return to these very three arguments at the end to make sure I've adequately addressed them. What we see today, if anybody even starts with the opponent's arguments, is they often kind of wander into their own world and start talking about something that has nothing to do with what their opponents actually think, and they're in some other land that isn't going to be persuasive at all. But Thomas always returns to a genuine encounter with a different point of view at the very end of any article that he has. What a beautiful methodology. And if only we could do this even in the academy, it would be great. Like I do a lot of reviewing, as I'm sure you do, of academic articles where I'm just, this person is not wrestling at all with what their opponents think about this particular issue in a fair way. And I often have to point out, like, this person needs to address this person and this person and this person if this article needs to be published or something like that. And that's at the highest academic levels of the discipline. If you just go into regular old discourse, it's even worse. And in fact, the incentives are set up in such a way, again, on social media especially, to not engage with a serious point of view of one's opponents. In fact, the way to get the likes and the love and the good comments and the shares and the retweets is to caricature the people that you all want to hate on, right? You want to dogpile on, and to play into, again, biases and caricatures that people have. But it sounds like you might do this too. I do this with my students. I don't do it quite like Thomas, but I often ask them, like, to do an assignment like this, a 1-page, 3-paragraph paper where they ask their own question, central question, critical question that comes to them when they did the reading. And then their first paragraph is their response to that question. The second paragraph is what they imagine the best opposing view is to the view they just articulated. And then their third paragraph is an attempt to respond to that opposing view. So a thesis, antithesis, or antithesis, and synthesis at the end. And they struggle often in the first part of the semester articulating that second paragraph because they've been formed in such a way, again, to not do the Thomas thing. But by the end of the semester, they do it enough that there's they get into a rhythm with it, and it really works. And I have to tell them, like, if you struggle with that third paragraph, good, right? That's a good thing. You've entered into a larger world. You've encountered a point of view you didn't encounter before, and you've broadened your perspective. And that's what at least the academic enterprise I thought was about, and I think is about. And so that methodology or that general approach of Thomas was just so good, so beautiful, and I wish we had more of it, frankly.
And I would describe it as charity, right? Charitable.
Yeah.
And if I come back to the beginning of this conversation, I would propose that maybe the link of the movement from the individual forming one's conscience to entering into the public sphere is charity, to move forward with charity. So let's kind of finish our conversation there. Like, how would you define the kind of Catholic perspective on charity? I mean, we use it. We kind of use it in a very reductive way. Charity means giving alms, or giving money to an organization is usually how we describe it, but it has a much fuller and richer meaning, I think, in kind of Christian understanding, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we just finished Holy Week, and we heard Christ's commandment to love one another as I have loved you. And Christ loved especially those who were considered unlovable, right? Those who you're not supposed to love, and even commanded us to love our enemies, which just sounds like poppycock, right? But it's Christ's command to love our enemies. And as you and many on this call, I'm sure, know, a lot of the great thinkers have tried to parse out what exactly that means. What does it mean to love your enemies, even if you're under attack in war, for instance? Augustine thought if you killed your enemy, you had to do so out of love for the enemy, because Christ commanded us to love our enemies. So if we're wrestling with that, which I think we should be, frankly, then it's even more apparent we need to be wrestling with how we love those who we perceive as our opponents on a particular set of issues or political disagreement or whatever it may be. And at the very least, that means giving a genuine, thoughtful, careful account of their point of view if you're going to criticize it. But it might even mean more than that. It might mean, I think it does actually mean, keeping yourself open to the encounter with them such that you reserve the right to change your mind. And you don't go into it with just a kind of, I'm being fair to your point of view, but my whole goal here is to try to take it down, even as I'm fair with you. It might be that through the encounter, you end up changing your own mind. And that's part of what charity towards your perceived opponent in that context, I think, means as well.
Okay. Well, I think this is a good place to stop with charity as the link from the conscience to the public good or the common good. So, Dr. Camosey, thank you for joining us tonight and sharing with us your own perspective on this. You said, and being honest with us, that these are things over which theologians are grappling and debating and disagreeing with each other as well. But so long as there's charity at the center of it, then there's the opportunity to move forward rather than kind of reducing ourselves into our polarized sides.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, Chris. This was fun.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. Have a good evening, and look forward to having you join us at a future event sponsored by the Center for Faith and Spirituality. Have a good evening.